OG Rose, and today we're going to be presenting in honor of TUCON 2024, the situation of capital. I have to work today, so I'm presenting earlier, and the conference has been magnificent. I've really enjoyed it. I think it has just been an example of the possibilities of social coordination and community today that has not been possible really until now, until we've had this technology that brings together Zoom, YouTube, and people that are also interested in the questions of what it means to be fully human, what it means to extend our humanity, what it means to think outside, say, the logic of capital, or to think outside the zeitgeist, to be able to think in a manner that is not so captured by the society. And I think that requires spaces to cultivate what maybe Ivan Illich would talk about as conviviality, to learn how to use our tools in a manner that extend us versus replace us. I'm going to be talking today on the situation of capital. I've had a few talks at Theory Underground about this topic, and it's a way to think about the opening of Marx. We're going to be talking about things like the labor theory of capital, of value. We'll be talking about value form, and how I think a way that we can approach Marx is writing early in a way as a kind of sociologist before sociology has developed. I think he is talking about things like plausibility structures, referencing Peter Berger before Peter Berger. I think he is also trying to ask questions of how social fictions come into being and how they have causal impact on our lives, even though they seem to be fictions, right? You know, money is just paper. And yet saying money is just paper doesn't free us from his logic, and it still has an impact on our life. Well, that's odd, right? That's extremely odd. Zizek will talk about the fetish, and that these social fictions, and I think that's what Marx is alluding to. And I think we have to understand Marx if we're going to think about new ways of social organization and the means of production, because these things impact us. We can say all day long that we don't like the means of production, or we find them oppressive, or we find them not generating wages that can keep up with the cost of living, and yet they're still there. So we have to think them. And I think Marx provides very useful tools for that. And I think he also helps, as Dave has talked about in his class on sociology, he's really helped pioneer the immanent critique, which is the idea of going into something immanently, a system, and thinking about it according to its own logic, to see how it may contradict ultimately according to its own logic. But contradiction does not necessarily invalidate a system if everything in a way is contradictory, as we learn from, say, Hegel, as Todd McGowan will emphasize. In fact, that contradiction can be an opportunity for the unfolding of that logic to a sublation. That contradiction can be the tension that leads to a new possibility. But anyway, so thank you, TUCON, for the opportunity. They will be having all-day presentations over that will be going on. It will be fascinating. They have a tremendous panel, just many presenters. I highly suggest. So to talk about the situation of capital, I would also say that Friday, I was speaking about Thursday, was speaking about Ivan Illich and the idea of a convivial life versus the manipulated life. And he really was very interested in the question of how we can use our tools to extend our humanity, to aid friendship, versus us end up manipulated by them. And three words that come to mind to think about Mr. Illich would be disablement, dynamics, and dwelling. We can think about disablement by the idea that it becomes very difficult to think outside, say, the logic of capital or the economic system. We're disabled from thinking about things as not the commodity form or fungible. In the same way, we seem disabled today. We don't know how to go into the forest and make a fire. We can struggle to gather with friends and not rely on our cell phone versus learning to, say, tell a story. And this creates dynamics, and I'm thinking game theory here, that creates things like everyone is trying to get the fastest tools or the most technologically advanced economy. And this creates an arms race between nations, you could almost say, multipolar traps, Nash equilibrium, that leads to a suboptimal result that I think we could associate with this kind of idea of the logic of capital moving through AI, as Nick Land talks about. And basically, if we don't understand dynamics, we are probably going to end up self-effaced. So we need to understand them. And if we don't, we're not going to learn to regain the art of living, which will be tied to dwelling, the possibility of us dwelling again as human beings, which would require us to be aware of dynamics and would require us to be aware of the ways that we make our tools and then our tools make us, how the medium matters, and medium and means of production, the social field, all of these tied together. If we don't understand those things, we're not going to be able to dwell very well. And today, a way that those three operate and disclose themselves to us in our lives is relative to and conditioned by the situation of capital. So I think Ivan Illich and Marx go together. Now, many people understood Illich and accused him of being a kind of Marxist, but I think Illich is a Marxist if he is in the sense of the social condition and the idea of dynamics having a life of their own beyond us. And so I think you can think about Illich to the situation of capital, which then ultimately will lead us to questions of what I like to call tragic or trade-off sociology versus more of a conspiratorial sociology, where you're looking for ways that power manipulate people, which again has a role. But one of the issues is, unfortunately, human beings can like to be manipulated. We can like people to be reduced to a single characteristic because that makes them more intelligible to us. So we have to learn to resist that temptation, which ultimately will be a resistance of the pleasure principle, as I will get into. Samuel Lunkar gave a tremendous presentation last night at TUCON, and he asked a wonderful question. Are we going to fix ourselves as human beings? Because that is kind of the question. AI, he was talking about how kind of AI reflects back to us ourselves. He talked about how human thinking is fundamentally a network effect. And one of the reasons we can't understand consciousness and thinking in that sense is that we think through this network. And so when you're thinking about thinking, you're trying to think about the thing that you have to think through to even think. So it's kind of like a first principle, very similar, I think, to when the great Benjamin Studebaker talks about goodness. Goodness is something you start from, not think to. And he was talking about that with Plato. So it goes with how thinking works. And I think is that thinking is through which we have to assume by which to go about understanding it. And Samuel Lunkar was saying that, the fact that we really don't understand how it's a black box AI works, well, that's just reflecting back to us ourselves. But the more we can create social conditions and networks like we see at Theory Underground, the more we'll actually be participating in thinking. And we also have to work against things like specialization and hard distinctions between science and the humanities and philosophy and so on and so forth. Because actually those hard limits stop networking and connections, of which is the place of thinking, which is the space in which thinking occurs. And so if you have those hard distinctions, you can't engage in thinking. And ultimately, I would say that logic also applies to the idea of our ability to think beyond cultural logics. Or if we're stuck in a single cultural logic, like the logic of the economy, we're not able to think according to beauty or goodness or philosophy of humanity or conviviality. This also is going to hurt the ability of thinking to come together to actually realize its fullness. So if we want to fix ourselves, I think we have to understand the situation. And John, good to see you. So what do I mean by situation? Well, I'm thinking Leibniz, and the great Anthony Morley wrote a tremendous book on Leibniz. Everything I know about Leibniz is indebted to Anthony Morley. He's a genius. And one of the ideas that he talks about with Leibniz is the idea that intelligibility is fundamentally geometrical, that the way we understand things is not algebraic as points, but as situations. When I look at that bookcase, it's more of a situation than it is a thing. It is a network of relations between wood and a shape and doorknobs and glass and all of these things. We can't just say it's a bookshelf that's kind of empty. And again, that one thinks of some of the remarks in Hegel's Science of Logic, where to talk about a tree, you start having to pass over into otherness and talk about the limbs and talk about all these different things, so they kind of pass over into otherness. You can't talk about a leaf without then talking about a branch. So it's always a kind of moving. There's a movement going on. Well, Leibniz understood that as well, in my opinion, because there's always this, in order to understand what a thing is, you always have to compare it, and then you have to judge that comparison in order to make it intelligible. So the example Leibniz makes is of two temples in the analysis of Citas. So if he says things are similar, if you would confuse one as the other if you didn't experience them in the same geometrical space. So like it's identical because when you go in it, you think you're in the other temple. The point that he's saying is the only way to tell that two things are similar, not the same, is to bring them together into the same situation. And good to see you. And so you have to bring similar things to find out that things are similar and not the same. They have to come together into the same situation. So intelligibility always has a certain comparison, because he's thinking about, when he thinks about form in the Platonic tradition, he's thinking about similarity. And when we make something intelligible to us, we're often comparing it either in a mental situation or a physical situation, and we're comparing the things with our experiences, with our ideas. There's always a certain comparison going on. That's what makes things intelligible. We do not things are not intelligible to us as points, as things that are kind of just floating in a just kind of like an unrelated space. It's always in a network. It's always in a space. The reason why this is important is because I think if we understand that intelligibility is geometrical, then we can understand what Marx is doing to talk, and why Marx can be associated with situational thinking, because thinking and intelligibility and abstract social use is going to be situated in a social order. So Marx is more geometrical than he is algebraic, which I would align with Leibniz. And so, Evan, good to see you as well. So let me make an example of this. So what Marx asks is, when we decide that, say, a shovel is worth $3 or something, how do we arrive at that? There are no equal signs in reality. You don't look at $3 and it equals a shovel, right? That's not how that works. There is no equal sign in reality, in the same way that there's no similarity in reality. We are making a judgment. We are adding that similarity through the act of intelligibility, right? So when you decide that a shovel is worth $3, you are seeing reality in terms of that abstraction and making it intelligible to you. But you see, you would not make a shovel worth $3 if there wasn't a social order where the idea of $3 is intelligible, right? You have to have a plausibility structure that supports you in that assessment. And thank you, Anne. So this is where Peter Berger is important, because Peter Berger is going to talk about plausibility structures, where it is very hard for human beings to function according to certain categories like money or government or politics. Like, these categories aren't in nature, right? Like, we come up with them and then operate our lives accordingly. But if we were to do that, and we were to run into our neighbor and start talking about money, and they're like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. Then that wouldn't work, right? So there has to be a way in which the category of money becomes intelligible to everyone. It becomes a plausible category to everyone. Otherwise, it won't work, right? So a social order has to create categories that everyone finds plausible if it's going to organize behavior. But here's another problem. Those categories have to be abstractions, or else they're not going to apply widely. What if we were to organize society by the category of, football? We say, okay, that's worth 2 footballs or something, right? I know that's a crazy example, but the idea is, well, football might only be a valuable currency to people who like the sport. Maybe people in America, it's quite limited, right? What if you were to talk about, well, let's try to trade according to food? Well, that's a barter system. Well, the problem with that is that things like, pizza, you might only be able to trade with people who, like pizza, right? So that's limited. So you have this problem where if you want to organize social behavior, you need the means of organization to be abstract, not bound to particularities, because if it's bound to particularities, there are only certain people that may use it or like it or stuff like that. And that would limit its effect, right? So you're looking for an abstract social category that a lot of people would find plausible as a grounds of value that would not be limited, in scope, right? And this is where we come to the idea. So then Marx is asking questions. He's like, okay, what is that category? Now, also please note, this is very important. When we read the Marx, we have to realize Marx is not just arbitrarily coming up with categories and saying, oh, it's value, labor is how people organize behavior. Like he's pressing it upon the world. No, he's observing things. A lot of what he's describing is trying to understand what he is already seeing occurring, right? It's not where he just decides that, labor is somehow tied to the question of abstract social use. He is seeing that people are already organizing themselves and valuing things in certain ways, and he's trying to understand how, right? So that's really important. This is not just a man theorizing in an ether and pressing upon the world. It's also just based on observations. And one of the key ideas that Marx arrives at is the idea of labor. We organize and determine value by labor. Now, Marx is interested, the reason why he gets into all of this is because he is extremely interested in a certain paradox that Adam Smith leaves us with, I believe. And it's the water diamond paradox. And he's kind of like, why is it water without which we die not that valuable? Whereas diamonds, which we don't need to survive, are incredibly valuable. This doesn't make any sense. So it can't simply be that value, which is a loaded term, of course, but if you grant it to me here, value can't simply be a means of necessity. There has to be something else going on. Now, the paper will hopefully elaborate on this point, but basically ultimately arrives at saying, well, it has to have something to do with the difficulty of getting. It's really hard to mine diamonds, right? It's really difficult, whereas water is easy to get. So there's some abstract sense of labor that ties to why diamonds are more valuable than water, even though you don't need diamonds to survive. Also, you could get into things like diamonds' social status. They are symbolic. There's a sign value, as some people will talk about. So there are other variables. But notice all of that. Like that is tied now to a social order, status, categories of the society, the sign value of the diamond. These are all now, there's a certain value that's now getting mixed together with an entire sociological situation. Now, there is something, though, very important in Marx, where he makes a distinction toward the start between labor, I would like to say labor and work. He says, if you go out in the field and start digging holes, you're not necessarily going to get paid for that, right? And yet you're working very hard, right? It has to have some sort of social use. It has to have some sort of social value. Well, this is very important because if there is a distinction between work and labor, then it is not merely physical exertion that creates value, but a certain social situationness, a certain social horizon in which labor can be defined as work. And then, furthermore, there is that idea that Dave talks about all the time where, you're standing at work at Starbucks behind the counter at the warehouse as a kind of standing reserve, ready to employ your labor, to have your labor ready to go as coordinated by the boss, right? Well, that right there is your value. You're being paid to be there because you have an abstract social value there. You have abstract social labor that can be deployed at any moment and used at any moment, right? And so that's why you're there. That's what you're being paid for. So what ends up happening is a social situation, and it's not merely algebraic. It's not merely just a point. It has to be tied to a whole social horizon that organizes, what's a good use of time, what's valuable, what's not. The social situation helps us divide just toil and work from labor. Then labor is also defined according to a kind of abstract value so that we can arrive at prices. So labor is even more abstract. So this is important. Labor is not merely sweat and toil, although it has to have some kind of grounding in reality or it would be a total abstraction. And I'll elaborate that in a second. But labor is gradually moving to being something that's abstract. And because it is abstract, it can be socially organizing. Because if it was too bound to the particular, it couldn't have this effect. And it was good to see you, sir. It's a pleasure, and Evan as well. So labor, so you get work divided into labor, and then labor starts moving to an abstraction that can organize behavior and activity, right? And that's a whole situation. Now, tying into Berger, one of the reasons why labor seems to be the means of that we go into to be the basis of abstract social use and value is because labor is very at hand. And labor is something that we can kind of all relate to. We know it is hard to work, right? And we can see work. Labor is something that's in reality. It's physical. It's not a pure abstraction. And because it is not a pure abstraction, it can be the basis of a social organization that does not feel made arbitrarily out of the blue or things like that, right? So when we talk about the idea of labor, that's a plausible idea to us because in the society, we see people working, we know what working is, and so it can function. So one of the reasons why it would seem to be the case that labor becomes a kind of a major main indicator of value is because it is plausible that things are valued according to the difficulty of making them. That's not crazy. And also, we ourselves, if we've worked at something, can kind of have the feeling that, wow, I put a lot of work into this, it should be worth something, right? Well, now we can start to see why labor comes to be the basis of abstract social use, because it's kind of at hand, to almost use a Heideggerian term. And it's something that functions as a potential that can also organize our behavior that becomes plausible to be willing to pay for as well. It's like, yeah, labor's hard. This person worked hard to get this diamond. I should pay for it. Right? It's a plausibility structure. It brings with it that something plausible. Now, this is where, and I'm not sure if this is what Marx thinks, but this is something that I think about, because now we have this question between value form Marxism and the labor theory of value. And Shahil, he's incredible, and he was making a point that there's a danger where if we don't connect value and labor, because then you might be taking political power from the working class, right? You're saying, oh, well, if we're ultimately saying that value, the value form, is more so like in a Heinrich tied to the modes of exchange versus, the modes of production, aren't you removing political power from the working class? Aren't you removing a certain legitimization to the rising up of the proletariat or things like that? And that's a very fair concern. At the same time, value seems to be that human beings can do beyond just labor, right? I can value something because I find it beautiful. I can value something because I find it lovely, or I can value someone because they're a friend. I can value this because I feel like it's convivial and extends my humanity. So there seems to be an issue as well, though, where value doesn't seem to be completely bound to labor. Now, you could argue here, well, at this point, we need a new word, right? Mikey's brought this up. Nance has talked about the problems with the word value, all of which I highly sympathize with. And that's a conversation that can certainly be had. If I were to use the term value here, and say that human beings are valuing beings, people like Stein and Gaffney talk about the I of value. I know McGilchrist talks about like valueception, this idea of, creating value. Then humans are valuing beings. One thinks about relevance realization and so on and so forth. Now, I know Vervaeke has pushed back against the word value because it's so economically latent. At the same time, I don't think we want to demonize economics too much, because there is a form of it that habituates us into the inability to operate outside the commodity form. But then economics can also provide pricing mechanisms and pricing coordination, like Hayek or Mises or different people talk about. The issue is that when I talk about Hayek and Mises, I think the issue is there is a non-psychoanalytical subject that is assumed in economics, that the pricing mechanism that helps us coordinate resources can also train us out of the ability to think beyond the logic of capital because of the feedback loop that we'll see with the habitus of sociology. So there's a major problem here. But the question is, do you overthrow the pricing mechanism, or do you create a social dialectic between social and pricing mechanisms, social coordination and pricing mechanisms that could then sublate into a new possible society? And I'll talk about, the liminal web basically as a social coordination mechanism that is necessary for the sublation of capital beyond its own logic. upcycle. Good to see you. So, there's different ways to go. So anyway, the way that I think about trying to work value form and labor theory together is to say that without labor, we can't quantify value socially. Like labor, without the working class, the social order is not intelligible, because labor provides a way for us to make intelligible abstract social use so that we can organize together. But in labor being the value quantifier under capital, that does not mean that other forms of value form are impossible, say according to beauty or intrinsic motivation or so on and so forth. The issue is that, unfortunately, labor, in working so well as a organizer of the society, can train us out of the capacity to imagine new conditions of possibility. The curse is that it works. And in working, we get into habits of not thinking in any other way. And once that occurs, if there's a certain irony where capitalism actually needs a profound human element so that demand exists, so that there's intrinsic motivation. I'm now thinking Keynes or Cohn in terms of the Great Stagnation. I'm thinking about the solo residue, on the idea that you can't really understand wealth creation simply in fluctuations of capital or production, that there's some mysterious human element involved. Well, here's the great irony then. Capital, intending to train us to use labor at hand to quantify abstract social use, then creates a condition that trains us out of thinking beyond that logic, which we need alternative logic in order to keep capital from heading toward a stagnation, falling wages, falling wealth, and so on and so forth, right? And yet the very mechanism that creates the economy then habituates people out of it, is always going to have a rebuttal and response to whatever, if you turn the nation against the capital, then it just turns the state will turn on it, or capital will turn on the state, and it becomes this very complicated triplex. But what if instead of an overthrow, we're talking about changing conditions of possibility by adding a dialectic to the pricing mechanism, which I would associate with social coordination. And this is where I think work like what's being done at Theory Underground is so important, philosophy, Porter, Voicecraft, and so on and so forth, because that is adding a dialectic to the pricing mechanism so that you can be working toward a negation, sublation. And then, of course, that's creating a network of relations that is adding a new dimension to the situation of capital so that you can actually start doing the work of fixing ourselves. Now, to also elaborate a little more, before I will have to run off to work in a little bit here. The other way to think about the problem with capital is capital, in precisely the way it kind of works, is as an information coordination system. Like when I go to the store and I see a hammer is worth $10, that communicates a lot to me very quickly as a language, right? I don't have to understand all of the intricacies of the hammer to know that it's worth that amount. And I can decide based on the money that I have if it's worth getting or not, right? So it coordinates activity. Likewise, I can decide if a job is going to pay me $20 an hour or something, if it's worth doing or not, right? There's a lot of information that is communicated quickly. Likewise, what occupations can do, and this is another reason why capital functions so effectively as social coordination, is if I meet someone and they tell me I'm a plumber, or they tell me, oh, I work in engineering, I can say, oh, I understand you. I get you. I don't need to know your philosophical beliefs, your worldview, religion, or anything. I can get a sense of understanding you without having to go into all details, right? And here's the trick. As much as human beings may say that we don't like reductionism, that we don't like compression, we don't like to have ourselves reduced, but we actually can often like for other people to be reduced because it is too difficult to, get to fully know them, right? And so there's a way in which the very reductionism and compression of markets into simple categories of identity or simply markers of price, as much as we may say we dislike that, at the same time, if somebody comes up to us and starts telling us their life story or all of their philosophical beliefs without training or creating new habits like a place like Theory Underground can offer, well, then we actually may not like that at all, right? And so, and then we can kind of move away from it, right? So if we And then, of course, here's the other issue. And I'm now thinking about Peirce, the great Peirce, the American pragmatism. Parsons, good to see you. He talks about in his essay, The Ethics of Belief, one of the main functions of belief and thinking is actually to avoid anxiety. Thinking is not so much in the business of determining truth as it is giving us a sense of stability and, scratching a certain itch. And the reason why that's important is because prices, occupations, jobs, they make us feel like we understand reality. And so we're not anxious, and it scratches that itch. And as a result, we're happy, right? So we get into habits of compressing to avoid anxiety. Now, here's the sociological dimension, though. As we get used to compressing people and the world to make it understandable, to scratch that anxiety, we then lose the habit of thinking outside of reductionism, right? We lose the habit of thinking of people beyond their occupation or their price or whatever, right? And then compression, which it could be like a zip file, right? Like you could compress somebody into their job and then uncompress them as you want to learn them more. But the problem is the act of compressing this then gets us in a habit of doing that, and compression becomes flattening. And then we lose the ability to expand our humanity again, because we're always creating habits. And also, we like the feeling of understanding. Cadell has emphasized that the brain has a libido factor, a pleasure principle. It feels nice to understand. And James K. Smith will talk about you are what you love, what you like to do, you form habits around, and you become your habits. Your character is a reflection of your habits. One thinks about Aristotle here. So if we like the feeling of understanding, then we're going to like compression. We're going to like reducing things to abstract labor quantification and thinking of it that way, because it feels like we understand the world. And then compression becomes flattening. Once you get that flattening, you lose the human dimension, I think, that capital needs to avoid stagnation, declining wages, all that other stuff. And at that point, capital, which trains you into these habits, flattens human beings into a mode of operation that then leads to the auto-cannibalism of capital. Because ultimately, if we take people, ultimately without dialectic, something dialectical thinking that leads to sublation, you're always going to get one could even think of a Marcuse, kind of one-dimensional man, where rationality pulls us, like that angel of history that Benjamin talks about, or the mouse in the little fable that can't turn around, pulls us into a Nash equilibrium, a suboptimal result, right? So once you're flattened, you're one-dimensional, you're stuck going forward. You can't think situationally, geometrically, and you're stuck in whatever direction you go in. So if we don't want to do this flattening, this compression, flattening, then stuck, we have to create spaces of thinking, according to different modes of consciousness. Studebaker has emphasized this, thinking outside the mode of capital. Unfortunately, since the brain likes understanding and capital gives us a feeling of understanding, we're going to have to go through a feeling of doing something we don't like in order to get out of reductionism that leads to all these problems and stagnancy and so on and so forth. We are going to have to do something that might feel uncomfortable. And of course, the logic of capital can make us associate comfort with right and doing what we're supposed to do, and discomfort with something we're not supposed to do, right? So you kind of have to work through something that feels like you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, precisely to get out of this flattening that can cause so much stagnation. Well, why would we even think that? Why would we ever even think that doing something uncomfortable like that is wise, right? We're not going to get paid for it. We might actually become, people may not hire you if they know that you do philosophy. TUCON has made that point, right? Well, this is where one needs models. One needs to see the full conviviality and fullness of human beings on display to see those possibilities. Furthermore, if it is the case that you can end up in the world that we're in is a kind of Nash equilibrium, where when everyone does what's rational, you end up in a suboptimal result, as hopefully belonging again to one we'll talk about. The only way you deal with that is by doing something non-rational, something that seems irrational, but it is actually the non-rationality necessary to avoid that suboptimal result. You have to do something that seems silly, like in the prisoner's dilemma, in order to end up with the best result. Well, that's what we're kind of seeing here. But here's the issue. If what Marx is describing is a situation, and it's a situation we have to think to move from manipulation to conviviality, as Ivan Illich says, then it will not simply do to overthrow a point within the situation. Like you say, well, we're going to overthrow the state, or we're going to overthrow the markets or something. Well, you see, we could do that, but still only be able to think according to the logic of flattening and capital and different things. And as a result, all we may do is go crazy, because you let in the real, you let in the surprise, you let in these experiences you're not ready to think, and then you could collapse. Like maybe one thinks of the French Revolution, and you just look through history at all these revolutionary activities that ultimately eat themselves, right? Because if you overthrow something but don't have the mind to handle the complexity that will come forth as a result, then you might just be destroyed. And this is the real. We have to be ready for the surprise of the real in a Lacanian sense. And so there's an issue of, when you're talking about, this is why there can be this emphasis of conditions of possibility versus overthrowing something. Because imminently, if you change the conditions of possibility within a thing, you can actually have it hatch, kind of like I think Hegel will talk about an embryo sort of transforming. And if we think of the social order as an embryo that needs to hatch open, then the questions are, versus something that needs to be overthrown that then throws in the real, and we haven't, the majority have not been trained into the mind to handle that lack of compression and fullness. Well, then you could just end up in a worse situation, right? But if we think instead of the social order as an embryo that needs the right condition to hatch, or seed to grow, to pass over into otherness, the negation sublation, well, then the question is, what do we need to add to the world now to bring about that emergence, you might say? Well, I think this is the social coordination system, because we have a pricing system and not a social coordination. And again, if Marx is describing a situation, then we need to be aware of the situation and can change the conditions of possibility in the situation, which is tied to how we understand the world, how we are socially habituated to understand things. We can't just change one variable in the situation. You have to introduce something that gradually results in a certain transformation and change of the entire situation through time as it unfolds at a rate that people can handle, and that we ourselves can handle. And I'm thinking here, Lovecraft, with the craft in parentheses, Beatrice, if she smiles too soon, Dante is reduced to ash. And we gave a presentation on that at Philosophy Portal with Dante thinking Lovecraft together, and Lacan, and so on and so forth, right? So you always have this problem of the rate of change that is not going to give you unintentional consequences. It will prove difficult, but it doesn't necessarily have to be self-effacing. And that is going to be tied to these rates and introductions and transformations, which then, to even be possible, requires a certain faithful presence of people to the social coordination system, so that sublation can occur. And I think if we start to think this, we can start to kind of approach what it would mean for us to fix ourselves. It would require us to reclaim the value form from having us overly rely on labor to quantify value to us. We'd have to own our, again, Stein and Gavier talk about the I of value, or valuation of McGilchrist, the ability, attention, awareness, Illich, to regain the ability to value a thing, not because we're told it's worth $20, but because we see a quality in it that we value and that motivates us and attracts us, which is scary. Because once you start valuing things, you have to make a choice that you're responsible for. You have to let the thing disclose itself on its own terms versus the ways you construct it. You're having reality open and disclose itself in an entirely different way, which can be frightening. But if you don't do that, then you're just going to turn to the labor form to do the quantification for you, and then you're going to flatten yourself and not be able to regain fullness. So we have to reclaim the value form. For conviviality versus manipulation. We have to resist temptations to compress to avoid anxiety, which will flatten us. And we need to participate in a means of social coordination, a new social coordination mechanism to make the situation dialectical so that it could sublate. And I think ultimately, too, when we think about the social coordination mechanism, that I do think we are seeing at Theory Underground, Philosophy Portal, Voice Grid, and emerging online, because it allows a effective means of social coordination that was not possible before. I do think this is actually realizing, to return to Leibniz, what he's referring to when he talks about the universal science. And Morley has made this point. And what Leibniz is interesting, like Leibniz basically wants to argue that for us to get a universal science, a science of everything, it has to be based on quality, not quantity. We have to be able to see things we have to coordinate according to quality in a manner that we can understand and that can actually help us figure out how to organize it, not just quantification. Leibniz thinks that science has mostly been quantifying and categorizing and compressing. Well, that, Marx is like, yeah, exactly. And that's kind of spilt over into the social order. And yes, Parsons, that is why falling in love is dangerous. But danger and value are connected. If we don't take risk, we can't create value. So we have to do something dangerous. But the question is how to do the dangerous well. And if we don't have effective social coordination, we probably won't. Or if we do a bad job, we won't even be able to realize we did a bad job because we're compressed out of the capacity to see and realize that. So for Leibniz, we have to learn to coordinate activity according to quality. Well, how in the world do you do that? Beyond your immediacy, I can experience the qualities here, but beyond my immediacy, what does that even mean, right? Well, this is where something like what's going on here is really important, because you can see on YouTube different qualities of life, different qualities of behavior, different qualities of thought, different qualities of speaking, different qualities of life, right? And coordinate your behavior and motivation accordingly. It's models. Aristotle, as Jockin will emphasize, we need models to determine how we're going to organize our life. And if we see models, we can organize ourselves beyond our immediacy across pluralism and the globe, beyond just the logic of capital, beyond just the labor form, to help us understand value. We can have better ways by which to coordinate value socially. And that's what one needs at this moment. I think we are at a moment in history where we need to make that absolute choice to really own social coordination. And I think following kind of Hegel, when you reach a point of a historic moment, Ebert would talk about saturation points. When you reach these points, if you don't introduce or make the choice you need to make, like introducing a social coordination mechanism to the pricing mechanism, then you're going to undergo self-effacement, as opposed to sublation. And that's what we're seeing, right? That autonomous capital, as the logic of social organization and habitats forming, eventually leads to a loss of, I'll talk about intrinsic motivation. One could talk about drive, or intrinsic motivation blurs with extrinsic motivation. It is all according to the logic of capital. Well, once that occurs, you get a stagnation. You lose wealth creation, and then the meaning crisis, as Vervaeke, or nihilism, as people talk about, right? Well, the very fact that that is all occurring is evidence that you are approaching a moment that needs sublation, or it's going to end up into effacement. And if we think of that in terms of a social evolution of a kind, well, evolution is an environmental. Evolution is in response to the environment, right? Evolution is not separable from situation. And if we want to socially and mentally evolve convivially versus according to manipulation, then it is going to be tied to how we change our environment and what is in our environment. And right now, our environment does not entail social coordination. And so it is not possible to have a universal science, a science of which brings together all disciplines, that can then coordinate ourselves, which of course brings us back to Master Lunkar's work from last night, where he was saying that we have these distinctions between all of these different fields that is causing trouble between philosophy and science and so on and so forth. And Leibniz would be like, yeah, that's against the universal science. And as a result, we're losing thinking. We can't think as full human beings. Well, then we can't be convivial. We can't avoid manipulation. We're going to end up in a Nash equilibrium. Well, Leibniz tells us that if we want a universal science, it has to be brought together and coordinated on terms of quality in the development of quality, which we can associate, I think, with the development of value. We have to be able to organize value across discipline, creating a new habitus that will get us into new habits of thinking according to value and quality, not just quantification, of which will bring forth a quality human being, not simply a quantified human being that has been quantified according to the labor form, standing reserve, and all of these other things that feel dehumanizing. Well, of course, we're going to feel dehumanized if we have no means of coordination that doesn't rely on dehumanization or flattening, right? If we do not want that, then you're talking about coordination according to quality. You're talking about the universal science. You're talking about tearing down these distinctions between all of these different fields, which again, that's, you know, what Lunkar was saying is that AI doesn't do it. AI is a black box. AI does not do that. And we don't know how it works because you get these emergent results. You don't know how they work precisely when you have all of the disciplines together in one place. And then Lunkar was also saying the lines between language and math are small, and that symbolic all together in that integrated form can give rise to thinking. And so, you know, if we want to do that, then we need a social coordination mechanism, a universal science in the Leibnizians that makes that possible, right? Well, it's possible now, and to deal with the situation of capital calls for it. The situation of capital basically pins us down with the choice of, do we want to introduce social coordination to it, and thus the possibility of sublation, or are we going to let ourselves be effaced by a continual process of flattening because we're out of the habit of dealing with the fullness of human beings. We're out of the habit of thinking about the world outside of compression and reductionism. Well, the choice is ours. And the situation of capital is one that presents us with that choice. And I believe also this is a choice that did arise for human beings back in the 19th century, when sociology first came onto the scene, which I believe starts with industrialism, the beginning of globalization. One can look at the Dutch Empire and so on and so forth. But instead of taking on the challenges of tragic sociology, which I think present us with this choice of coordinating ourselves according to value and quality, we instead went down a road of compression. But now that moment of history is back, and we have to think at it. And what I mean by all of that is going to be covered tomorrow when we talk about tragic sociology, trade-off sociology, and an examination of value forms beyond the logic of capitalizations today at the conference. They will also have more tomorrow, and you can also find some of the recordings from yesterday and the day before on the Theory Underground channel. And I again think that what we are seeing at Theory Underground is an example of the social coordination that is necessary for us to sublate the situation of capital into something convivial versus manipulative, which will extend our humanity to, well, a place we want to go as opposed to a place that we don't. Thank you all, and all the best to you.